Hello everybody, I'm some Loudmouth on the internet with an opinion. Say! It's Miller time! Well, assuming I don't get sued for that joke, today we'll be taking a very unique look at the Frank Miller classic movie 300. Released in 2007, 300 was an unexpected box office hit that quickly gained a following with this highly stylized retelling of the Battle of Thermopylae. For this video, we will be examining just how much of 300 is just simple Hollywood flair and how close this movie gets to what actually happened. And I say we because this is actually a collaboration video that I'm doing with Ernie of HistoryDen. HistoryDen is a fantastic educational resource for those interested in history. Through HistoryDen, we find dozens of fantastic videos educating on many different historical periods. From the Greeks to the Romans to even more modern history, there's a great wealth of great content here on HistoryDen. But let's be honest, many people have their perception of the past shaped by Hollywood and other forms of mass media, which is why comparing the actual historical record to Hollywood adaptations of historical events is actually a lot more important than it seems. Due to its very over-the-top nature, it's been the subject of a number of parodies and knockoffs over the years.
1776. It ain't accurate, but it'll blow your f***ing mind.
But the actual line between Hollywood and history is actually very different from what many people would guess it would be. So, take it away, Ernie.
I'm pleased to do a review on 300. And of course, this was a very, very popular movie on ancient Greece, and it concerned the events surrounding the Battle of Thermopylae. Overall, I really enjoyed this movie. Even though it's a very highly stylized account of the Battle of Thermopylae, there are actually a lot of historical accuracies. There are some people who are willing to discount this right off the bat, but actually I think this movie was right on in some aspects regarding this battle. Now, other parts obviously are fictional and very stylized, and we'll talk about some of those as well. But again, I enjoyed this movie, and one thing it did, it generated a lot of interest in ancient Greece. I can't tell you how many people have emailed me and told me that they started watching my series on ancient Greece because of this movie.
When the boy was born, like old Spartans, he was inspected.
Now we look at this opening scene here where this Spartan elder is reviewing this baby to see if it's worthy to potentially become a Spartiate. Now a Spartiate was the citizen. That was when you became a full-fledged citizen of Sparta. And so pretty much this is very accurate. You were judged pretty much from the day you were born. Can you cut it? Can you become a Spartiate? Can you become a member of this society? And so this was evident from day one. You were judged very, very early on.
Spartans only viewed two ways of death as dying for the good of the state. One of those was, of course, dying in combat, and the other was when a woman died in childbirth. AKA, they viewed dying in childbirth, and by that extension, giving birth in and of itself, as an act that was primarily not for the good of the individual, but for the good of the state.
Now, the movie also talks about the agoge, which was this sort of training camp from hell. That's what I like to call it. And basically, from the age of 7 until your late teens, you were thrown into this. And you were constantly tested to see if you could make it. And there was all sorts of types of horrific games you had to play. And so the movie catches this aspect very well. You would literally get the crap beaten out of you. I don't think there has ever been a training program that was more intense than what Spartan boys and young men had to go through in order to become a Spartiate.
And if necessary, to kill.
And these clothes that the Spartans wore, they were very scantily dressed. I guess that's the best way to put it. You were given just enough to survive in terms of food and clothing, but that's it. Again, they wanted to see how tough you were. Can you cut it as a Spartan warrior?
The wolf scene is entirely a work of fiction. There is absolutely nothing in the historical records of King Leonidas as a young boy ever fighting a wolf. Nor does this come from any ancient Greek myths or anything of the sort. This was entirely made up by comic book writer Frank Miller, and of course this was left in the movie based on his book. Basically, the wolf scene was meant to be a metaphor for the Battle of Thermopylae coming up later. Unable to overpower the wolf in an open space, the young Leonidas instead lures the animal into a tight space and uses its power against it. Much like luring the far superior Persian army into a smaller space would be an advantage in the upcoming battle.
Perfect.
One of the main reasons I so adore this movie, despite the historical accuracies that we name in this video, is that every scene of this movie is a stylized piece of art. You can take any frame of this movie, hang it up your wall, and it is like a brilliant tapestry. And this wolf scene is one of my favorites. Just the style of confronting this beast. It's a beautiful thing to watch. Another thing about this movie that was very inaccurate is that horses actually do not run in slow motion. They ran at normal speed even back then. But if there was no slow motion in this movie would be like half as long.
Now, this scene where the Persians are galloping to Sparta, and you can see here they're going through this field of crops. And this is actually what went on in ancient times. A lot of ancient cities would have had their fields of crops surrounding the city. They would have kept them very close to the city because, as you know, it was not easy to travel in those days, so it made sense to keep the crops very close to the city. So this is actually very accurate.
Now, what message do you bring?
Earth and water.
You rode all the way from Persia for earth and water.
Now, one thing the Persians demand right away in this movie is this symbol of earth and water. And this is exactly what the Persians demanded from the Greeks. And I think Leonidas' reaction here was probably very similar to what the Spartans' reaction was. He gives them this very strange look. And that is the Greeks simply did not understand the concept of being a subject. Because that's exactly what you were when you gave that symbol. When you gave that symbol of earth and water to the Persians, you now were a subject to the Persian Empire. And this went against everything the Greeks stood for. They believed in the concept of a citizen, that it was the citizens who made up the city, not some perpetual king. Now you might be asking, well, wait a minute, the Spartans had kings in this movie. Leonidas himself was a king. Well, yes, that's true, but they were very limited actually in the amount of power they had. There was an assembly and there were all kinds of checks and balances against the king of Sparta. So he was not an absolute ruler in any sense of the word. So again, it was this whole concept of earth and water that the Spartans and the Athenians and some of these Greek city-states in the south simply could not tolerate. They simply could not give that symbol.
On top of the obvious influence of British common law, the founding fathers of the United States heavily based their concept of separation of powers on both the ancient Romans as well as the ancient Greeks. This is probably the biggest area where the ancient Greeks were, how you say, progressive in their thinking. They developed a system of separation of powers and a strict rule of law that everyone in society was equally bound by. Everyone from a slave to the very top king was bound by the law. This is something that can be quoted and admired to this day, and was a big example of the ancient Greeks' forward thinking.
This is Sparta!
And they actually did throw the messengers into a pit, as you can see in this scene. They actually did throw them into a pit. I don't think it was a bottomless pit like this, but they did certainly toss them into a pit. That was their response. So again, I think the film captures the sort of essence of this conflict, that these two civilizations really were incompatible in every way. Now, previously, many empires had given that symbol of earth and water to the Persians, and that simply meant you could do business with the Persians. And actually, the Persians were pretty gentle as rulers go. They just wanted their tribute. If they got that tribute, they pretty much left you alone. So they were not sort of these evil bad guys that the film portrays. And one other point that the film does not show is the fact that these wars really were started by the Greeks. They initially, before these events at Thermopylae took place in this movie, they initially marched into what would be modern-day Turkey and burned one of the Persian cities down to the ground. And at the time, the emperor Darius was furious and reportedly shot an arrow into the sky and vowed revenge. So that is one of the reasons, or one of the primary causes, of the Persian War. And again, that is not discussed in this film.
Hey, what can I say? We Greeks like to start shit. Hey, it's why we have such a thriving economy. Oh, wait.
Is this all of them?
As you ordered. 300.
Now, one thing that generated a lot of press about this movie were these bare-chested Spartans. And while that's going to attract certain people in the population to go watch the movie, this is not how it was in ancient Sparta or ancient Greece. The ancient hoplite, or ancient Greek warrior, would have had armor from their head to their toes. They would have been covered in bronze-plated armor. That was pretty much the primary type of armor that was used. So again, the film gets it wrong in this regard, because the idea here was that metal armor was going to give you a serious advantage over your enemies, mainly enemies outside of Greece. Most of the other Greek warriors would also have been covered head to toe in armor.
This change represents a very, very highly problematic thing in our society that I think needs to be discussed a lot more. The fact that handsome Greek men are frequently just seen as sex objects for the desire of the straight female audience. My eyes are up here.
But the Persians and other nations were not. In fact, the Persians mostly had wicker armor. So when they got up against the Spartans and other Greek city-states, it was pretty much a bloodbath. In other words, they were at a very serious disadvantage from an armor standpoint. Now, there's this scene where the Spartans meet up with some of the other Greek city-states, mainly the Arcadians.
Did you bring only this handful of soldiers against Xerxes? I see I was wrong to expect Sparta's commitment to at least match our own.
You, there. What is your profession?
I'm a potter.
And you, Arcadian, what is your profession?
Sculptor, sir.
Spartans! What is your profession?
See, old friend, I brought more soldiers than you did.
Now, this scene is inaccurate as well. First of all cities in ancient Greece loved everything about the military. The ancient Greeks loved military. They thought about it, they lived it, they breathed it all day long. So fighting was just in their blood. So it wasn't as if the Arcadians, as they're presented here, were a bunch of cowards. They were not. In fact, they produced some of the finest warriors in Greece. So when the Greeks fought the Greeks, these were very, very bloody battles indeed. It wasn't as if the Spartans were these lone warriors and everybody else were just a bunch of wimps. That was not the case at all.
But it is true that ancient Sparta put far more effort into preparing for war than even most other Greek city-states. The reason why they did so was far from a noble one. In ancient Sparta, over 85% of the population were slaves, and they notoriously took slaves from people they conquered. Because of this, they were always in fear of uprisings and had to prepare for them. Back to the wolf scene, in reality, the rite of passage for a young Spartan wasn't to kill a wolf. It was sneaking up behind one of their slaves, known as a helot, and murdering him. Nice. Spartans believed so strongly in preparing for warfare that even the women were trained in combat. King Leonidas even states this in the movie.
Consider the fate of your women.
Clearly, you don't know our women. I might as well have marched them up here, judging by what I've seen.
Another item that needs to be discussed is the real reason why Sparta only contributed 300 men to this particular battle. The movie cooks up a subplot of the Spartan religious authorities being under the payroll of the Persians.
Corrupt.
Yes. And when Sparta burns, you shall bathe in gold. Fresh oracles shall be delivered to you daily.
This kind of gives King Leonidas a kind of lonely hero vibe, almost like the cop who only solves the case after he's been dismissed from duty and defying the religious authorities in order to protect Sparta. In reality, Sparta only committed 300 men because of a religious festival going on at the time, which is mentioned in the movie.
The carnea.
The only exception were the king's 300 personal bodyguards. So why did Frank Miller change this? Well, this is a change that actually goes well beyond the usual Hollywood taking liberties with history. For much of his career, Frank Miller has very often portrayed religion and religious authorities in a negative light. Frank Miller is a very hardened atheist. Sin City gave us, for example, Cardinal Rourke, the incredibly evil and villainous cardinal who engages in cannibalism.
I know it's pretty damn weird, these people. He didn't just eat their bodies. He ate their souls.
Going a step even further, he created Holy Terror a few years later, which was basically a long middle finger at the religion of Islam. The allegory he was trying to make is quite clear, trying to portray the Persians as rabid religious fanatics and the Spartans being more secular.
We rescue a world from mysticism and tyranny.
So the portrayal here of the conflict between ancient Persia and ancient Greece as a conflict between more religious fanatics and a far more secular society is largely a false one, and there's no real evidence that King Leonidas acted in defiance to any religious authorities when he engaged in the Battle of Thermopylae.
Zeus stabs the sky with thunderbolts and batters the Persian ships with hurricane wind.
Now, this scene where part of Xerxes' fleet sinks to the bottom of the Aegean actually did happen. And the storms in the Aegean during ancient times were very, very nasty indeed. And they could literally just come out of nowhere. And so many ancient fleets were wiped out by massive storms in the Aegean. So this actually was a big problem when ancient fleets tried to make their way across the Aegean Sea.
There can be no victory here. Why do you smile?
Arcadian, I've fought countless times. Yet I've never met an adversary who could offer me what we Spartans call a beautiful death. I can only hope, with all the world's warriors gathered against us, there might be one down there who's up to the task.
This actually is very accurate. The Spartans were looking very forward to the upcoming battle with the Persians. And that is really what the Spartans were all about. They were not afraid to die. There was nothing more glorious to a Spartan than to die in battle. And that's one of the reasons that armies feared the Spartans so greatly. Whenever you fight against somebody that has no fear of death, that makes it very difficult to defeat an enemy that fights in that manner. And certainly the Spartans, through their intense training, had no fear of dying.
Well, that's an easy choice for us, Arcadian. Spartans never retreat. Spartans never surrender. Persians! Come and get them!
The idea of the phalanx was to keep all of your soldiers in a straight line, side by side, where they could link up all of their shields and then basically allow the enemy to charge them. And the idea here was that the spears would cut down the enemy, and that made it very difficult on an enemy that tried to attack a phalanx. You had to clear the length of the spear before you could even engage the ancient Greek hoplite. And so that's what's going on in this scene. You can see they're getting cut down by these spears. The whole key to this was to maintain the cohesion of the phalanx. If the enemy broke through the line, then the whole phalanx would likely collapse. So the whole key was to maintain the integrity of the first line. And if someone died, it was up to the man in the second line to fill the gap as quickly as possible. Now, this scene where Leonidas breaks ranks and goes on this sort of rampage, this was not exactly accurate. And that's because of what I just mentioned. You would not break ranks like this. The whole key was to keep the formation intact.
Yeah, apparently it was thought that the more historically accurate phalanx maneuver just wasn't cool enough to give this movie its wow shots it needed, which presents a bit of a plot hole for later in the movie. Earlier in the movie, King Leonidas turns down help in combat from a hunchback who's eager to help the combat effort because, due to the man's deformity, he's useless for the phalanx formation.
Raise your shield. Raise your shield as high as you can. Your father should have taught you how a phalanx works. We fight as a single, impenetrable unit. That is the source of our strength. Each Spartan protects the man to his left, from thigh to neck, with his shield. A single weak spot, and the phalanx shatters. From thigh to neck, Ephialtes.
What King Leonidas says is very accurate about how the phalanx works, but because of this movie's stylized action scenes, we see them frequently fight throughout this movie outside the phalanx. So why does King Leonidas feel the need to turn down help from free soldiers when he's outnumbered like 100 to 1?
Now, the one weakness of the ancient Greek phalanx was that it really could only go in one direction, and that was forward. So that was pretty much the strategy. You moved in one direction, You maintained the cohesion of the phalanx. Now, the inherent weakness of the phalanx was that it could not be surrounded. If it was attacked from behind, that caused a big problem because, again, you could really only march with all of your spears in one direction. So that's when Leonidas, when he was surrounded, basically let the other Greeks go home. And of course the 300 stayed back, knowing full well that they would die once they had been outflanked. And again, that was the inherent weakness of the phalanx. If it was surrounded, that was usually an unfortunate circumstance. And so that's why Leonidas knew that it was basically over at this point, and they decided to die in glorious combat.
Another fun fact about this movie is that many of this movie's seemingly pulp action lines actually do come from ancient Greek historical records. Yes, it's possible that ancient Greek historians kind of spiced up the story just as much as Hollywood can today, but it's pretty cool that lines like,
"Our arrows will blot out the sun."
Then we will fight in the shade.
Or,
"Spartans, ready your breakfast and eat hearty. For tonight, we dine in hell!"
actually are lines from history. History is badass.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed this movie review of 300.
Thank you very much, Ernie. It was great collaborating with you. To my audience, please go subscribe to HistoryDen if you want to hear great material and great education about history. And please check out all the great content on this channel. And as always, come back to our channels with your shields or on them. I'm some loudmouth on the internet. You just heard my opinion. If you like this video, please consider making a donation to my Patreon. Thank you.